So in today's video, we have a roundup of Final Fantasy news. We're talking the Metacritic scores of Final Fantasy XVI, some interesting tidbits in regards to Final Fantasy VI potentially getting a remake, and then we're going to tackle the difficult question of what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game. If any of that sounds cool to you guys, feel free to click the like button, subscribe, and smack the bell icon to stay up to date with more Final Fantasy news. So getting to those Final Fantasy XVI reviews, the embargo has lifted a day before the game's release. And normally when an embargo lifts a day before something is supposed to come out, whether it's a game, a movie, or a TV show, that's normally a red flag that the product is not good and studios don't want the general public to know until the very last second. But that doesn't seem to be the case with Final Fantasy XVI. It is currently sitting at an 88 on Metacritic and a 90 on OpenCritic, which is pretty much where a lot of analysts were expecting it to land, somewhere between 85 and 90. So this is really great for the game. And if we look at the critic split on Metacritic, out of 100 views currently, 93 are positive, 7 are mixed, and 0 are negative. And a good number of these outlets are giving the game 10 out of 10s, 9 out of 10s, very few low scores. And if we look at Famitsu, which is actually kind of funny, they gave the game nearly a perfect score, a 39 out of 40, and its 4 reviewers gave the game 3 10s and a 9. So whoever the reviewer was that gave the game a 9, you might want to go into witness protection for a little bit, hide out, let things kind of blow over, and then you can resume your normal life because people will be upset with that. But even then, a 39 out of 40 from Famitsu is pretty astonishing. Now, I wouldn't recommend going through and reading a number of these reviews just because there are some outlets out there that don't care about spoilers and they will sprinkle them throughout their review without any warning. So read those at your own risk. But looking at a general consensus, a lot of the positive aspects from reviewers seem to be the overall story being great, the characters are great, and the gameplay itself, that action combat is fantastic, with some of the negatives stating that while the story overall is great, it does have some pacing issues, with the slow parts feeling really slow. Disappointing character arcs, side quests that are hit or miss, and some of the game design feeling dated and shallow, namely the RPG elements of the game design. But overall, the negatives don't seem to be strong enough to hold the game back from being received really positively. So this is a pretty big win for Square Enix. The game seems to be fantastic. I may have to wait until next week to play it because Best Buy hasn't shipped out my copy yet. So eventually I'll be able to get my hands on it. But overall, this is really, really great. Now, moving on to Final Fantasy VI and that potential remake. There was recently a roundtable discussion that was held to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the Final Fantasy franchise. And in that roundtable, they spoke to the brand manager of Final Fantasy, Yoshinori Kitase, and they asked him about the potential of a Final Fantasy VI remake. Thank you to Genki on Twitter for taking the time out of his day to translate this interview to give us all of the details. Big ups to you, man. You do some incredible work in this community. Kitase goes on to say, I think Final Fantasy VI Remake would be difficult. Final Fantasy VII Remake is not yet finished, so I'm not able to think about it, but there are many Final Fantasy VI fans inside the company, and they often ask me, when are we making 6? Hironobu Sakaguchi, who is the creator of Final Fantasy, also does chime in that remaking Final Fantasy VI would be difficult because that game was a pixel-based game and not a polygonal 3D one, so attempting to remake it would be difficult because you'd have to find ways to change the story and reimagine the game as being fully 3D. So while that's not exact confirmation of Final Fantasy VI getting a remake, it is reassuring to know that people within Square Enix are thinking about remaking it. 6 is a beloved entry in the franchise, and it's a game that so many fans have been asking to get a remake of. So the fact that they're at least floating the idea around and talking about it is reassuring. Now, I think we have to talk about something pretty important, and that's the identity of Final Fantasy. What makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game? Because ever since 16 was first revealed, it was hit with a massive wave of criticism from a lot of veteran fans saying, this is not Final Fantasy. I can only use one character, and the combat is fully action-based with no RPG elements? Nope, not my Final Fantasy. Which, look, 16, it's not the first Final Fantasy to receive this type of criticism. 15 got a lot of flack, especially when it came to its small cast of characters. What is this? I'm controlling a boy band? 14 got tons of flack with its poor launch. Even games like Final Fantasy VII and 6, which are beloved, have some sort of criticism from fans. And there really is so much more that goes into shaping what Final Fantasy is. It's not just purely combat or how many characters you get to control. There's a lot more to it. And thanks to Jason Schreier of Bloomberg, we got a pretty cool deep dive into that thought process where he was able to go to Square Enix and interview some people, including Yoshi P and Yoshinori Kitase, and really talk about how Square Enix has been able to keep the Final Fantasy franchise alive by constantly reinventing what it is. So this all starts back in 2015 when they're finishing up development on Final Fantasy XV, which would release the following year. The then Chief Executive Officer Yosuke Matsuda would call Yoshi P into his office to ask him to begin development on the next installment of the Final Fantasy franchise. And keep in mind, this is hot off the heels of Yoshi P and his team saving Final Fantasy XIV with A Realm Reborn, rebooting that game and making it one of the biggest MMOs on the planet. So at this point in time, Yoshi P has completely proven his worth in salt to the then president of Square Enix, giving him the confidence to ask Yoshi P to lead the next official Final Fantasy. Yoshi P would obviously accept on the condition that he'd be able to use Creative Business Unit 3, as well as bring in Hiroshi Takai to help him with this game as its director. Now, Yoshi P goes on to say, "We got absolutely no feedback from them on what we should be making. It was up to me and Takai to think, okay, what should the next Final Fantasy be?" And funny enough, this entire development team was filled with people that grew up playing Final Fantasy, and they had to be coaxed away from not sticking too close to what Final Fantasy had been in the past, those traditions that most people think of when they think of a Final Fantasy game. Yoshinori Kitase goes on to say, "They have a lot of respect for the series, but it's risky in that we might be hanging on too closely to past values." Kitase also adds that during development, Yoshi P would often come to him to ask for permission to add a feature or play around with character names. Kitase would respond, "I always tell him, there's no need to ask, you can just do what you want. Whenever he comes to me, I tell him, don't ask me anymore." Which offered Yoshida and his team a lot of flexibility, which he does acknowledge is something that's a blessing as well as a curse, stating that the last few big Final Fantasy games had major flaws. Final Fantasy XIV coming out and being incredibly buggy and rushed, and then of course there's Final Fantasy XV, which was panned pretty hard for its incoherent story. There were times where something massive would happen, a loading screen would hit, and a wall of text would have to explain what took place off screen. So it was very jarring. As much as I love Final Fantasy XV, the Royal Edition in particular, I can acknowledge that that game had some pretty big story flaws. And he goes on to say, freedom wasn't leading to success in those situations. Now, speaking on the one requirement Kitase did have that this Final Fantasy game would need, and that is crystals. Now, if you think about crystals, they've always played a pretty massive role within Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy XVI in particular has literal crystals that are powering the planet that these nations are all fighting over. And you look at something like Final Fantasy VII, while there's no like one big crystal in that game, you can look at Mako in the live stream as a metaphor for that crystal, the lifeblood of the planet that's being drained. And this stuff could technically be considered a crystal because it gets turned into materia that our characters then use in battle, but maybe that's getting a little too into semantics here. But the idea is that whether it's a literal crystal or a metaphorical crystal, these themes of crystals have permeated the franchise since the beginning. And that's what makes Final Fantasy so great, is that it can be whatever it wants to be. That's what keeps it exciting and keeps it fresh. And despite how different 16 might be, they do touch on the fact that there are a lot of traditional things in 16, including chocobos and Moogles and a man named Sid. Every Final Fantasy has to have a Sid. 16 has their Sid, and he sounds like he smokes 20 packs of cigarettes a day, and I love it. Now, this next section of the article is going to get taken out of context 100%. I'm sure it's already happening. But they ask Kitase on what the future of Final Fantasy could be. Could it potentially be something that turns into a first-person shooter? Kitase does respond by saying he'd be open to a Final Fantasy game in the style of Call of Duty, as preposterous as it may sound. And he does acknowledge that a lot of these newer ideas tend to come from the younger development staff. He says, "My imagination really has its limits, so it's really great to have a new generation of creators on board." And as crazy as a Call of Duty style Final Fantasy sounds, Yoshi P does go on to say, Call of Duty is using all this modern weaponry, but when you think about it, it's this small group of people going around saving the world. That's very Final Fantasy, he says, laughing. All it would need, he adds, is crystals. And then to end this video, we will end on a quote from Yoshi P himself saying, his definition of a Final Fantasy game is a game with a great story, great game design, cutting-edge graphics, great music, and the appearance of Moogles and Chocobos. If you have those things, I think you have a Final Fantasy. And I wholeheartedly agree with him. And that's what makes Final Fantasy so great, is that it's something different each and every time. It's a literal Forrest Gump metaphor, people. Mama always said Final Fantasy is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. Sure, some will have a sweet caramel filling and others will taste like toothpaste. But that's what keeps us on our toes. That's what keeps Final Fantasy fresh and exciting every time. That is the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think about the Metacritic scores? What do you guys think of this article talking about the identity of Final Fantasy? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.